It is the autumn of 1943, and somewhere in the grey corridors of a requisitioned country house in Buckinghamshire, a man is carefully folding a map. Not a genuine one. The paper is real, the ink is real, the contour lines and grid references are rendered with painstaking accuracy, but every road, every bridge, every safe route marked on that document leads nowhere safe at all. It leads straight into disaster. He smooths the final crease, slides it into a leather case indistinguishable from those carried by German officers across occupied Europe, and hands it to a courier without a word. Somewhere across the channel, that map will find its way into German hands. And when it does, men will die following it. This is not a story about bombs or battleships. It is not about the thunderous machinery of conventional warfare. It is about something far quieter, far more insidious, and in many ways far more devastating: the deliberate weaponization of information itself. Britain, cornered in the early years of the Second World War, outnumbered in material and outpaced in industrial production, turned to the one resource the enemy could not easily manufacture: deception. And nowhere was that deception more coldly brilliant, more forensically constructed, or more lethally effective than in the production and distribution of false cartographic intelligence maps that looked like salvation and functioned like a sentence. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand how desperate the situation truly was. By 1940, Germany had demonstrated something terrifying to the Allied High Command. It was not merely that the Wehrmacht was well equipped or well trained, though both were true. It was that the German military machine operated with exceptional cartographic precision. Officers at every level relied on detailed, up-to-date maps. Artillery units required accurate grid references. Armored columns needed route intelligence to move with the speed that had made Blitzkrieg so devastatingly effective. Logistics officers depended on maps to route supply convoys, identify fuel depots, and navigate the complex road networks of occupied territories. Maps, in the modern industrialist war that Germany had pioneered, were not a convenience. They were a nervous system. Cut the nervous system, corrupt it, feed it false signals, and the body would destroy itself. The British had observed this dependency and begun to ask a question that was, in its quiet way, revolutionary. What if the map itself became the weapon? The problem, of course, was execution. Producing a convincing forgery of German military cartography was not a matter of drawing some roads on a piece of paper. German military maps were produced to extraordinarily high standards by the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahmen, the Reich Survey Office, using specific paper stocks, specific ink formulations, specific typefaces, and specific cartographic conventions that had been refined over decades. They carried unit stamps, classification markings, revision dates, and reference codes. A forgery that failed on any one of these points would be identified immediately, and worse, would alert the enemy that a deception program existed at all. The men tasked with solving this problem were gathered under the auspices of a department so deliberately obscure that even today its full scope remains only partially declassified. What is known is that by 1941, a dedicated unit operating under the broader umbrella of the Political Warfare Executive, or PWE, had established a forgery operation of remarkable sophistication. The PWE itself was headquartered at Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire, a setting of almost theatrical incongruity, one of England's great stately homes, its baroque corridors now lined with printing presses, its drawing rooms occupied by cartographers, linguists, and intelligence analysts. Here, and at associated facilities whose locations were distributed across the home counties to minimize the risk of a single catastrophic bombing raid, the work began. The technical challenge was immense. Authentic German military map paper had a specific weight and texture, roughly 80 grams per square meter, with a slight off-white tone that distinguished it from British standard issue cartographic paper. Obtaining or replicating this paper in sufficient quantities required both industrial chemistry and considerable ingenuity. Agents in neutral countries, primarily Sweden and Switzerland, were tasked with acquiring samples of authentic German materials wherever possible. British paper manufacturers, sworn to secrecy, worked to replicate the precise composition. The ink formulations presented a separate challenge. German cartographic inks had particular optical properties, including a specific response under ultraviolet light that German security officers were known to use when checking documents for authenticity. British chemists worked backwards from captured samples to reconstruct those formulations with sufficient fidelity. The typefaces were perhaps the most painstaking element. German military maps used a combination of standard cartographic Gothic script and a specialized topographic lettering system. A team of typographers working under conditions of extreme secrecy cut new type blocks by hand, working from photographs and captured originals, to produce printing plates that could pass scrutiny under magnification. And then there was the content itself, the actual geographic information printed on the maps. This was where the operation achieved its most elegant and dangerous dimension. The forgeries were not simply invented from nothing. They were based on real German maps, real German terrain, real German road networks altered in ways that were subtle enough to escape casual inspection but catastrophic enough to produce genuine operational disaster. A bridge marked as intact that had in fact been destroyed. A road shown as passable that was, in reality, a flooded track impassable to armored vehicles. A fuel depot indicated at a location that was, by the time the map reached German hands, either empty, destroyed, or under Allied surveillance. The alterations were surgical. A competent German officer reading the map would find nothing obviously wrong. He would simply drive his column towards a crossing that did not exist, or route his supply lorries through a valley that had become a killing ground. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Distributing these maps required a network as sophisticated as the forgeries themselves. They could not simply be dropped behind enemy lines in bundles that would immediately identify them as plant material. Instead, the PWE and its sister organizations developed a series of distribution channels of almost Baroque complexity. Some maps were inserted into genuine document caches captured from German personnel and then returned through prisoner exchanges, through neutral intermediaries, through the deliberate abandonment of document cases in locations where German recovery was certain. Others were passed through resistance networks with instructions to ensure the documents reached specific German units or headquarters. A small number were distributed through double agents, men and women who had been turned by British intelligence and were feeding a controlled stream of plausible material back to their German handlers. The psychological effect on German units who had navigated using corrupted maps and survived to realize it was documented in several post-war interrogations. One former Wehrmacht logistics officer, interviewed in 1946, described discovering that a map he had relied upon for a supply route in northern France in late 1943 had directed his convoy along a road that was not only impassable but overlooked by a position he later identified as a British coordinated ambush point. He had assumed at the time that the map was simply out of date, a common frustration in fluid operational conditions. It was only after the war, reading declassified accounts of the PWE's activities, that he understood the road had been put on the map specifically for him. The Germans were aware, in a general sense, that document forgery was an Allied capability. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, issued periodic warnings about the reliability of maps obtained from non-standard channels. But the very sophistication of the British program, the fidelity of the paper, the ink, the typefaces, the classification markings meant that many forgeries passed through standard German authentication procedures without triggering suspicion. The damage was cumulative and largely invisible. Columns arrived late, or not at all. Supply routes proved unexpectedly difficult. Positions marked as defended turned out to be empty, positions marked as empty turned out to be fortified. The friction of war, already considerable, increased by increments that were difficult to attribute to any single cause. By comparison, German deception operations in the cartographic field were considerably less developed. The Abwehr did produce some false documents for use against partisan networks and resistance organizations, but the systematic, industrialized forgery of enemy military maps appears to have had no German equivalent of comparable scale or sophistication. American OSS units, operating in parallel with British PWE, developed their own forgery capabilities, but by most assessments, the British program, drawing on a longer tradition of psychological warfare and access to a larger network of neutral country intelligence assets, remained the more refined operation throughout the war. The legacy of this program extends well beyond 1945. The systematic use of cartographic deception established principles that would inform military deception doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The understanding that an enemy's logistical nervous system could be attacked not through physical destruction but through informational corruption through the introduction of plausible falsehoods into trusted data streams is a concept that has only grown more relevant in the decades since. What the men and women at Woburn Abbey were doing with paper and ink and painstaking forgery, their intellectual successors would eventually do with computer networks and satellite data. The weapon changed. The principle did not. Surviving examples of PWE map forgeries are held in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London and in the classified archives of the National Archives at Kew, some of which remain partially restricted even today. Those that have been declassified and publicly displayed are, to the untrained eye, entirely indistinguishable from authentic German military cartography. That, of course, was the point. Return, for a moment, to that country house in Buckinghamshire. The map has been folded, cased, and dispatched. The man who prepared it has returned to his desk, where another sheet of paper awaits another road to misplace, another bridge to erase, another route to corrupt. Outside the tall windows, the English countryside is unchanged, fields, hedgerows, the slow turning of a season. Inside, a quiet war is being waged with the most fundamental tools of human knowledge: geography, trust, and the assumption that a map tells the truth. Britain, in 1943, understood something the enemy had not yet grasped. The most dangerous weapon is not the one pointed at you. It is the one you are holding and do not know is wrong.